Well, thanks for having me here today, inviting me. I've been up since 4 in the morning, so I'm well caffeinated at the moment. I'm particularly excited to be here because, as Donna was mentioning, well, you have Minnesota in the house today because you had Christy Ellison, who's a great ally at our agency here, who you just heard from earlier. My organization, Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy, we are based in Minneapolis. We are a national environmental justice research and analysis organization. And so what we've really been doing, and what I hope to be sharing with you today, is how we're working, how we've been working in different policy processes in terms of the interchange of community engagement. And my background, so you know, is really in energy and climate policy. That's where my background is. I used to work at the Department of Energy and then worked in Minnesota on a lot of state and regional climate policy issues when we passed the Renewable Electricity Standard and was involved with a lot of regional governor associations sort of when the trading issues were happening there. And it was really through those experiences and that work that we founded the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy because there was such a critical gap in terms of communities of color and indigenous groups and low-income peoples in terms of how engagement was happening at these policy spaces. It was a very obvious gap. And I think a lot of the lessons I'll be bringing from the Midwest and also our national work relates a lot to what you're going through here. We also completed doing about training 130 different organizations on the Clean Power Plan, where we were really working to build community capacity on engaging on this federal national policy level and how to integrate environmental justice. So we worked at multiple levels around that. So I think it's really exciting here that you actually have a state process or a state government that's interested in moving environmental policy and environmental justice policy potentially forward. A lot of the examples I'll show you, they kind of mirror state and local, just because environmental justice organizations obviously have to work with whatever level of government is actually working on environmental justice at that given moment, if it's an agency and department that is willing to hear what they have to say. So I just want to start out with sort of, stepping back a little bit in terms of why community engagement, right? What are we really trying to do here in terms of why do we sort of move forward on this concept of community engagement? Now, I know some of you are community organizations in the room. How many environmental justice organizations do we have in the room? Okay, we've got a couple handful. So, and so I know we'll be having some deeper conversations tomorrow, which I'm really excited about. And how about organizations that have leadership in communities of color, low income, and indigenous organizations? More. That's great. That's great. So one of the reasons that we're sort of here today in terms of thinking about community engagement is this ideals of democracy, right? That those that are most impacted should be part of the solution building, right? That's sort of the larger democratic goal that we're trying to sort of achieve. And more fundamentally, in terms of community engagement, we're really trying to do, like, what is it supposed to do? It's really, the fundamental role is so a community can influence decision-making in order to make their community as healthy as possible. That's really the intent, right? We think about it in terms of a lot of process, in terms of, where are meetings, how are meetings happening, but the ultimate reason we engage in this endeavor of community engagement in public policy making is so that there's an outcome and an end result that community members can influence the decision making in order to make their community as healthy as possible. That is the reason a large number of community groups are even at the table. So this sort of concept of community engagement into public policy has been, there have been different models that have been moving forward, right? I think the dominant model, and the one here that you all, I'm starting to learn about the Oregon process that you all are undertaking right now. I think what I call here is the stakeholder process, is an advisory body, what you all are undertaking. So how community engagement has sort of been put into or institutionalized in policymaking. I think it started, in the early 2000s and has sort of been happening at the local, state, federal level, is that you have this sort of standard stakeholder process. I know many of you can't see it that are in the back, but you have your policy or regulation, which is sort of the key issue that is being focused on, and then you have a different industry, state agencies, local agency, technical seats, academic, health professional, business, environmental, nonprofit, right? There's seats at the table in the stakeholder process. Does this sound familiar to what is happening here? Okay. So this is sort of the standard process that's all over the country. And then community, which is the orange circle here, gets maybe 1 or 2 seats for the most part, maybe more. In some cases, like in the Minneapolis Climate Action Plan process that I'll talk more about in a little bit, and the state governor's climate process that we underwent about 6 years ago, that community seat is usually a hard fought for seat to even get that space at the table. And then when this table is set, it works to sort of, there's positives in terms of it works to garner sort of the opinions of sort of the different stakeholders that are in a given community are going to be affected by the policy. But environmental justice organizations tend to not necessarily favor this way of community engagement, namely because what it does is it tends to relegate environmental justice or racial justice and economic justice to a stakeholder issue, when it really is a fundamental sort of value and that should be across the board and a part of public policy making. And so this, I don't know why that's forward. So while this can be one way that has been moving forward, it isn't necessarily the preferred way. So, and there's always issues in terms of sort of who is going to take that community slot, right? What is the process? Who decides? What organization gets to sit there? In most of the cases that we've been involved with, the government agencies tend to also decide which community organization sits there. And so it's not necessarily leadership that has been chosen by the environmental justice groups and community members to sit on it. And it also kind of creates a little bit of it creates an uneven playing field in terms of the resources and the professional, a lot of the other blue circles here, right, in terms of industry, agency staff, technical, academic, business, and environmental nonprofit, are professional positions that are paid for, that have some resources and research capacity to sort of engage in very complex regulatory issues. Whereas the community organizations tend to not have that same sort of professional sort of resourcing to be at the table on equal footing. I'm trying to figure this out. So, but it is a process that we have, right? And so how do we start to build on it and a more robust sort of way of thinking about community engagement, where you have a stakeholder process, yes, that is sort of moving forward in government, but how do you start to build added layers so we actually get community involvement and engagement from these organizations that are the most impacted by the policy? And what we found in the numerous case studies we've looked at is that there are some intersecting layers that are needed for policy impact or community engagement. So one is a community-centered analysis space, and an additional layer is a community resident education. Okay? So a lot of focus and effort tends to go on the stakeholder process that is usually sort of resourced by government, whereas these other spaces tend to be happening sort of more informally, but are sort of taken for granted in the community engagement process right now that should be more codified into how we do community engagement. So just as an example, in the Minneapolis Climate Action Plan, I know we have some local officials here, but a lot of the work through that, to give you a sense, so that process in 2011, city stakeholder process began, and there was no Indigenous, low-income, or community color representation in that process, where the city is 46% communities of color. And so it took the EJ community petitioned for inclusion. It was a 9-month process to sort of negotiate the terms of what that inclusion would be. And so there were points of agreement established in terms of creating a community analysis space, and an official city environmental justice working group was established. Now I know this is a city example I'm using, but it's applicable to state processes as well. The environmental justice working group was co-facilitated with city staff support, so it was part of the process. But it was a community-centered analysis space with community control of the agenda, community control of experts, and representation in the stakeholder process and what type of documentation would result from it. So the Environmental Justice Working Group negotiated ahead of time that in the final recommendations that the ultimate stakeholder process resulted in, the original recommendations of the Environmental Justice Working Groups, unedited, would be part of the appendix. So people could also see what the environmental justice lens had been on these policies as part of the official climate action plan, regardless of what ultimately may have gotten taken away through the larger stakeholder process where other industry and business interests were present. And part of the recommendations, too, was that there was training for city staff that were involved in the process and were going to be involved in the implementation of it. So that they underwent not just general racial justice training, but specifically environmental justice training by trainers that were picked by the environmental justice community that they trusted would be relaying an environmental justice lens to the staff. So another example, and this is just a recent national EJ training workshop that happened by some of our close partners on the East Coast that you may want to talk to as well. Anna Batista, who is at the New School, Molly Greenberg with Ironbound Community Corporation, Cynthia Mellon with the New Jersey Environmental Commission, and Nikki Sheets with the Center for Urban Environment at Thomas Edison State College in Newark, New Jersey. They had a very successful community-driven process into passing a cumulative impacts ordinance in the city of New York. So they have to work at the municipal level because at the state level, it is a very difficult environmental justice conversation for them to have. That may change if the administration changes. But within that, they were talking also about this sort of link, right, in terms of what is the role and engagement that they can have in terms of land use planning with the local, with the city council and the land use planners at the local level that works in tandem with the permitting authority at the state level. And so using this community engagement sort of space to really focus on where they had more leverage. But what they did was they also created, when I'm talking about this community-centered analysis space, right, that works in conjunction can work in conjunction with a more formalized stakeholder process, okay? So again, you have the policy and regulation, so in this case, your air quality regulations that you're working on. That is the focus. So it's not sort of a general sort of environmental group that is coming together to look at general environmental policy, like environmental commissions that happen in different states or cities. This is actually focused on the particular regulation, the question at hand. And then you have community organizations, EJ organizations at that table, along with technical, academic, legal, health experts that are chosen by the community and trusted by the community. Organizations, for the large part, do have academic allies that they trust and work with very closely. And so but they get to decide who they bring in. And also what New Jersey did was actually hiring people on, legal consultants on, to advise them. So they were working for the community agenda, not necessarily this larger stakeholder agenda.
But paid for by the city?
That one was paid for by foundations.
Okay.
Yeah. So the key part here is that, this is controlled by and accountable to the community, but in the case of Minneapolis, it is part of the official process. So in the case of Minneapolis, it was actually co-facilitated by a community sort of policy expert, in that case climate issues, as well as city staff. So there is a communication that's happening in terms of where the policy process is at, in terms of the government agency, but there is a space for community to actually get their questions answered. Because what happens in the larger stakeholder processes, if a community organization will present a question forward, there are so many larger needs, and the imperative is not necessarily to answer that question, or it gets marginalized in the process. And so this way, you have a space where community organizations can pose the questions and have access to their own trusted consultants and legal and academic researchers to get it specifically answered. So just coming back to this, you have the stakeholder process, a community-centered analysis space, that intersection between those two. One way to really ensure that community groups, that you can start to level this playing field in terms of the power dynamics, that's been very useful, is memorandums of understanding. And has that been utilized here to a certain extent? Yeah. So what we found is that it's a very powerful tool in terms of being very clear in terms of what the relationship is between this community center analysis space and the stakeholder process. It clarifies the expectations among the two parties, establishes the working protocols for that policy and regulation in question. So in terms of what we found, what the city of Chicago negotiated with local environmental justice organizations that were working on shutting down the coal plants, as well as what the city of Minneapolis did with the environmental justice communities. There was governance protocols, so who gets to serve on these stakeholder advisory processes? What is the process for that selection? How are environmental justice recommendations getting discussed? What's the voting? The communication protocols, so the amount of notice on decision making, documentation, and final reports. The resources provided, the stipends, the staffing, the printing, translation, just clarity on all these fronts that in terms of actually coming together as joint partners in this endeavor. Facilitation and agenda setting. So who is going to be the facilitator? Who are going to be the co-facilitators? And how is the agenda going to be set? And then trainings for the residents. What does that look like for the state and city staff, and who is going to be conducting those trainings? And then this last one in terms of fundraising. Because what we're starting to see is that as community engagement is getting done by more government agencies, there's an impetus to start going after foundation resources, and so by the government, and which can create tensions with a lot of community organizations, because now you're competing with the very organizations that you're trying to build capacity for the same resources from foundations. And so that's caused a lot of conflict, and where does civil society have decision-making around and control over that community engagement process? So just in terms of the third sort of piece I had mentioned before in terms of the community and resident education. So in a lot of, in sort of the regulatory processes, there's set standards in terms of how community resident education and participation happens. In the geographic area of a permitted facility, what here is this is an added layer in terms of a partnership with community organization that's needed. So, because what the tendency has been, in a lot of cases we've seen is that education or outreach events by government staff will tend to be located in like the neighborhood of concern or by the facility of concern, but it's not necessarily that residents are from that neighborhood are coming. And so, for example, we'll have situations where our state agency or will have community education and events for getting community input into a certain regulation, and it will be like on the west side of St. Paul in a predominantly low-income community of color, but it's mostly white residents from the suburbs who are actually attending it, or from other parts of the city that are attending it. Because there hasn't been a partnership with community organizations in the environmental justice community and an investment in actually building up resident capacity to engage these very complex issues, right? We all know how complex regulatory sort of goal setting and standards can be. And so this is really intended to look at community education in a more holistic way, where how are you building resident capacity? And this is where the investment in organizing comes in popular education workshops, in debates, in role play, strategies that a lot of community organizations are well versed in, really focusing on some of the building the basic fundamentals. What are regulations? How do they get developed? What is cumulative pollution? What are the key issues identified by the community for that policy or regulation? And there are organizations that sort of specialize in how do you develop popular education for different types of policies. The Center for Urban Pedagogy out of New York is great in terms of land use and sort of how do you build up different curricula associated with that. Our organization, which has a lot of climate and energy expertise, has developed popular education around sort of cap and trade policy, the Clean Power Plan regulation. This picture here is of youth doing a toilet paper-led popular education piece on emissions of global warming emissions in their community. And so it takes, though, a lot of policy knowledge and expertise to break it down to a place where community can engage and then bring it back and build the capacity up for the engagement in the regulatory process to happen. So one other way to look at it, even though it is not linear, it's more of an iterative community engagement arc, is that you have, ideally, community resident education sort of from the start, right? From the very beginning. Because you need to, as you're building up, again, those communities and neighborhoods that are most impacted by the regulation that is in question, building up that community and resident education. In partnership with the community organizations, because they know they have the strategies and tactics in terms of how to do the organizing and popular education. Creating this community-centered analysis space so that community questions can get asked and answered by technical experts that they trust, that then also links up into the larger standard stakeholder process that are already part of a lot of our governing institutions. And then once the blue line represents the actual regulation or policy is actually passed, ensuring that during the implementation, that there's also a community engagement plan. Because that's the piece that gets lost every time, is that how is that accountability measure back into community, into sharing with community, into the community-centered analysis space, still ensuring that the intentions of the regulation are being met. And so I would say the larger stakeholder process, so the ones that the advisory body that you all have right now, is usually the only process in this continuum that's sort of intentionally institutionalized and resourced. These other pieces are tending to happen more on an ad hoc basis. Community organizations tend to put in their own resources because they know this is going to be impacting them. And you have, but there's opportunities and there's models, like in Minneapolis, to make this part of the community engagement process. Because it's happening already, but right now it's really happening in the backs of the community organizations as they struggle to engage in this process. And so there's opportunities to do that. And into the regulations, also ensuring that there is accountability for the post-process, that it keeps circulating back. Because as they're implemented, the community has the right to know what is happening, what reductions are being made, and if further revisiting of the regulations need to happen in order to reach that community health standard they have. So I just wanted to read this quote that comes out of some researchers that are really looking at the concept of power and public policy. And so if we're really serious about justice and environmental policy and regulations, it means addressing the distribution of power. And that's sort of the model we're putting forward today. So these new models that are being tried out in New Jersey, Minneapolis, Chicago. It'll look different for Portland, but there's definitely lessons to learn. So it says here, the unequal distribution of power in all its forms is the major source of inequity, and that community empowerment can have a sustained impact on this distribution of power. Empowerment refers to the process by which communities renegotiate power in order to gain control over the factors that shape their lives, including access to information and opportunity, decision makers, and policy making. So how do we start to institutionalize that in terms of renegotiating the power dynamic in order to get true community engagement into these policy and regulatory processes? Okay, so if our goal, in terms of going back to the original intent of community engagement, right? And this is an environmental justice workshop. So that Indigenous, low-income, and communities of color that are disproportionately impacted by industrial air pollution in Oregon can influence decision-making and make their community as healthy as possible, okay? That's our goal here, right, in Oregon. I would like each table to come up with an essential component of community engagement they feel is critical to the Oregon process moving forward, okay? And so we're going to take maybe like 5 to 10 minutes on that, and then I'd like each table to just talk about why that one component is critical. Does this make sense based on how tables are situated? Okay.
I've got an idea.
And yes, if you can have a scribe, that would be great, because I think this is also, I think the organizers wanted this to be part of the official record of the meeting, and so it'd be great to have it documented.